head of a multicultural school, Church of England's first school in Oxford, for 9 years before he started on his doctorate. His interest and his publications, as many of us will know, are wide-ranging in areas of children's spiritual, moral, social and cultural development, and of course the humanities. He's committed to a view of children's spirituality and recognises the distinctive contribution of faith communities. In 2018, his book, Developing the Expertise of Primary and Elementary Classroom Teachers, which I use a lot, Professional Learning for a Changing World, what a great title, and still extremely relevant today, considered how expertise is developed across the whole continuum of teachers' lives. So again, this really impacts upon the theme for today, it's IT and beyond. Tony now works as an independent research consultant, leading training, supporting teacher research and development, and as a stalwart support of NaPTEC for many years, and the perfect person to end our conference today. Supporting Tony for this last session is our esteemed NaPTEC committee member, Robert Young. So may I welcome you, Tony, and over to you.
Right. Sounds. And if I can just butt in, this is Jo here. I'm about to upload and share for you, Tony, the PowerPoint slides. So just to realize that I haven't forgotten to do that.
Right. Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you, Jo. And I'm not quite sure whether people will be able to see me, but it doesn't matter. I shall turn my camera off when the slides come up, which will hopefully be in a minute. If there's a slightly odd noise in the background, I've just taken my phone off the hook for a second. So if I can just say, yeah, thanks very much, Jo, that because of some difficulties we had on a practice, what I'm going to do is just go through relatively few slides, but I'm going to ask Jo just to move them on at particular points. There's only about 5 or 6 slides, but what I'm going to do is to sort of talk around them, because I've been in on the conference all day, and so I'm going to try and make reference to what other people have said, and I've got some notes of what I was going to say, and there's obviously the PowerPoint, but I've got sort of various notes scribbled across what I was saying, so I will try and weave those in. But before I start, I just wanted to say a brief story about back in May, June, July, at the time of the lockdown, when a lot of children weren't in school. And I've got 4 grandchildren. They're all boys, as it happens, 2 of them in one household and 2 of them in another. And we had these various Zoom meetings, and would say to their parents and to them, you know, how are you doing? Now, in one household, there's an 8-year-old who just thrived not being in school. I mean, he did the work that was sent by school, and that took him an hour or something like that. But he then went off, and with his support from his mother in particular, and made up all sorts of projects about the Egyptians and how to organize a football tournament with 20 people. And as I say, just seemed to thrive. And then his brother, who's a bit more of eccentric. I mean, he was very happy on his own. And there was one wonderful comment where somebody said to him, I won't give his name, but said, you know, how you get when he went back to school? And they said, how are you getting on when you go back to school? And he said, well, it's all right, but it gets in the way of the rest of my life. That's the problem. And then in the other household, also with 2 boys, but a bit younger, 6 and 4, they just found it much, much more difficult, both the children and the parents. And at the point when the school said, you know, do you want the children to go back? Both parents said, you know, we thought for about 15 seconds at the outside and said, yes, we really want them to go back because actually they need that. And I just tell that story because I think looking at it from the point of view of children, that I think some that they responded very differently, and both as teachers and as teacher educators, we need to be slightly wary of some of the generalizations that are around. So I'm now going to get into the bulk of what I'm going to say, but just to say I will stop at a couple of points and just see whether there are any questions, and then we can take any others at the end. So Joe, if we could just take the next slide, please. Thank you. So I want to start by recognizing the huge and unexpected challenges which 2020 has provided for the whole world, but in particular in this context for teacher educators. So I'm going to challenge a few highlights, and then I'm going to ask some what might appear to be simple, but are actually very profound questions, because I think my role, as I see it, is perhaps to take us a bit more away from some of the everyday and to some of the bigger issues that I think we need to bear in mind. So a few challenges just to start off with. I think we shouldn't forget the really big ones, which relate to the survival of the human race, of climate change, environmental degradation, sustainability, and this week perhaps in particular threats to democracy, and the rise of populism and many other aspects. By the way, I meant to say at the start that I'm going to sort of canter through, and I'm going deliberately to be a bit thought-provoking. So there'll be some things that people may want to pick up on in any questions, but I hope as we go along that there will be certain things that will set your thinking going, and other things maybe that will irritate you a bit, or that you'll go away and say, yeah, I want to think about that. The second one, which I think has become really evident this year, is the issues which relate to advantage and disadvantage, both in terms of the disproportionate impact on children from disadvantaged backgrounds, particularly obviously from backgrounds which are blighted by poverty. And Sam mentioned this morning those communities in South Yorkshire, and one could think of them in many of our urban and indeed rural areas. And then also that the movements such as Black Lives Matter, which have had such an impact during this year. And I think as we look through this decade, we do need to remember some of those very big issues which are to do with, above all, with poverty, but also issues to do with race and ethnicity and gender and disability. The third one, which comes out of some of my own work particularly, is recognizing the importance of culture. And in particular, remembering that some of our own cultural assumptions are not necessarily correct. The idea that children always need to be busy and need to be entertained. I mean, maybe we don't share that assumption, but I think many of us do, and many parents do. And actually, I think this year particularly has shown for many adults and for children the importance of space and time for reflection. A fourth challenge, which is a longer term one, is about the fragmentation of some of the structures which have previously helped children to find a sense of identity. And my most recent book has been called Identity, Culture and Belonging. And I'll come back to identity a little bit later. I think I really worry about the loss of the human aspect of education in the race for results and the narrowing of the curriculum, which I think many of us are concerned about, and in particular the marginalization of the humanities and the arts. And I'll say a bit more about the humanities in a few minutes. Coming more to teacher education, particularly the challenges of retaining and motivating teachers, especially in the medium term. And I was very interested in James's comment this morning about the rise in applications at a time when the economy is in trouble, but actually that the danger that hides some of the more systemic problems which lead to many teachers being demotivated or even leaving the profession within a few years. And I think that's linked to what I would see, particularly in relation to primary education, of the limitations of what I would call the delivery model and the deprofessionalization of teachers. And again, I'll come back and say a little bit more about that later. And then I think there are some new and more practical ones that many of you who are either teachers or teacher educators will know far more about than I do, such as a worry about an overemphasis on online teaching. I think particularly for young children, I think the face-to-face relationship is so important. And I think that also goes for those becoming teachers, but I think I'm thinking particularly there in terms of young children. And also a possible reduction in group work. And I was saddened to hear the other a couple of weeks ago, someone saying about how, because of many of the COVID-19 arrangements, that children were working much more individually and were not doing so much group work as they had done before. And the bit that really worried me was the fact of how many children actually really liked that. So I think that challenge of group work, which I think most of us would see as being extremely important, I think there is a worry about, I have a worry about that, because in the end, I think that learning is a social rather than an individual process. So if we can just move to the next one, Joe, please. Thank you. So I started off saying 3 simple questions to ask. What is education and what's it for, especially when we're thinking about young children? What does being a teacher entail and what's distinctive about primary teachers? And then what does being a teacher educator entail and what are the implications for teacher educators, both in initial teacher education and beyond? And perhaps I should just say that although I imagine probably most of you are working in initial teacher education, I do very much agree with the point that I think it was Sam made this morning about seeing teacher education as a much longer process and certainly the development of expertise, which doesn't happen. Well, it starts in initial teacher education, but then all the research on expertise talks about the first 3, 4, 5 years as being absolute, 3, 4, 5 years after qualification as being absolutely critical in terms of developing expertise. So I'm going to talk around those 3 questions and then come towards some conclusions. So the next one, Joe, if you would, please. So I mean, what is education and what's it for? And so here are a few points that I think won't be unfamiliar, but I think sometimes it's worth restating these, particularly if we're thinking towards the future. So I want to suggest that education is not just about skills for employability or for the future, but it's something much broader about the type of person, the type of people that we're seeking to educate, who a child is and who they become, and also the sort of society that we all create together. And I put in there perhaps a more humane society, a more compassionate society, perhaps a more equal society. And we would all come up with our slightly different adjectives there. But again, I think we need to be thinking about those aims if we're thinking about how we go about the process of education. I think this year in particular, but also a changing world, makes it particularly important that we help children to learn how to respond to and deal with uncertainty. And I'm not sure we're very good at that. And building up what I call robust but flexible identities, so that young people are flexible and able to cope with change, but that there is also a certain robustness and resilience to them. And again, I doubt this first bit is controversial, but qualities, and I would add dispositions, such as curiosity and resilience and empathy. And then I started off by putting independence. And I always like just to, when I think about independence, that yes, one needs to be independent, but also interdependent, as opposed to what I think are too often. And when I say our system, I don't just mean the school system, but a broader culture as well, often leads to, which is an emphasis on compliance, maybe some young people who are a little bit flaky, and the temptation to narcissism, which I think technology and the consumer society tends to encourage. And that is not to say that all children are like that. Of course, that's not the case. But I think these are tendencies that we need to try and work against. I think it must seek to enable children to have a sense of agency and voice. I think it's worth seeing education as a long game and not a sprint race. And I've used this analogy before. I mean, more like a ramble through an extensive range of different environments, or a never-ending series of museums. Certainly my own education, there was a sense in which there was we were all lined up on the starting line, and then the gun was fired and we all set off as if it was some sort of competition. And again, of course, there's an element of competition to it, but I think it's worth seeing education in a much broader sense. I think it needs to be balanced and broadly based, with more emphasis than is now the case on the humanities and the arts. And I think, as with my story at the beginning of the grandchildren, I think we need to remember that learning and education happens in many places other than schools, though of course schools do matter. So on to the next slide, if we could, Joe, please. So I'll take a pause for some questions and comments in 2 or 3 minutes. So you might be wanting to think about those. But one of the pieces of work that I've been doing over the last 3 or 4 years is in relation to the humanities. I mentioned the marginalization of the humanities and the arts, and I could say something about the arts, but I know far more about the humanities. And some of you may know that I and a number of colleagues set up an initiative called Humanities 2020, really to try and raise the profile of the humanities and to improve learning and teaching of the humanities. And we set that up before Ofsted's move to encourage a better balanced and broadly based curriculum. Though in passing, I mean, I remain completely baffled why Ofsted see a balanced and broadly based curriculum as important in Key Stage 2 and 3, but less so in Key Stage 1. But I think the more I thought about the humanities, I think it's only partly a curriculum issue, and it's much more one of pedagogy. And by that, I mean that I don't really see the humanities solely in terms of history and geography and RE and perhaps citizenship, which is how the humanities tends to be seen. But we've tried to promote the idea of the humanities as being, again, something which is much broader, on the lines of what I've put on this slide here. So that, put simply, the humanities matter because they enable children to consider questions of meaning and purpose, explore identities and values, and with that, concepts such as time, space, and faith, and that links obviously to history, geography, and RE. Develop skills and habits associated with critical and creative thinking, extend cultural and imaginative horizons. Next one, I think very important, learn to empathize with people who are different as well as those who are similar, and so celebrate diversity and challenging stereotypes. And then learn about democracy, global citizenship, and sustainability, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, some of those big issues that I mentioned at the beginning. So just before I pause, I just wanted really to come back to a point that I think Deborah made very, very well. I mean, and Sam had also touched on it, but Deborah made it in more in more depth, which is this issue of knowledge and the different types of knowledge. And when I think about the humanities, I tend to think of it, certainly there is some propositional or factual knowledge, but also it's to do with ways of working, what I would call procedural knowledge, and also personal and interpersonal knowledge. So I think this notion of knowledge and also the notion of subject knowledge does need to be unpicked in the way that Deborah was doing so.
Tony, it's frozen for me. The sound is muted.
Yeah, it looks like you need to unmute yourself, Tony.
Sorry, I may have I may have unwittingly muted myself. Sorry if I did. Joe, could you just go back just for a second, if you could?
Yes.
Apologies about that.
Fine.
Don't worry if you can't, but I just wanted to make one other comment, which I think is germane to the discussion, which is that I think it does present a dilemma for teachers and for teacher educators, because a lot of the way that I and my colleagues have been thinking about the humanities does imply sort of cross-disciplinary. And I mean, I come from a more cross-disciplinary background. Jonathan mentioned my interest in spiritual, moral, social, cultural, for example. But also within that, we need to try and enable children to understand the ways of working and the concepts which are associated with disciplines such as history or geography. So I think we need to recognize that dilemma. And maybe if I can just say one other thing for those of you who are in ITE, I know that Middlesex University in Roehampton have been doing some really interesting cross-disciplinary courses in the humanities, and we'd be really interested to hear about other people who are looking at that way in relation to initial teacher education. Okay, apologies that I muted myself. Shall I just pause and maybe somebody could see whether there are any questions, or I could pick them up or any comments or any challenges?
I'm looking through at the moment, and there don't appear to be any questions at this precise moment.
No. Okay, so let's open it up to the field. There's one straight away from Elaine. Go on, Elaine, you can be first.
Yes, Elaine, yes.
Yeah, do go ahead, Elaine.
Elaine, we can't hear you. Put your microphone on, please.
Hi. One of the things the government has done recently, which goes against some of the things, especially to do with global citizenship, sustainability, is to say that children are not to be introduced to ideas that go against capitalism. I just wondered what your feelings as a a person about the humanities feels about that.
I can't speak on behalf of Humanities 2020.
No, I don't mean.
I certainly can speak on behalf of myself, and I suspect most of my colleagues would. I thought that that guidance was just quite extraordinary, really. It does seem to me, if one is going to have trying to encourage critical and creative thinking, that actually it's really important, and I believe that this can be done from with children at a fairly young age, that one really does need to be introducing people to young people to a whole lot of different ideas. Now, I think apart from anything else, the question of what is anti-capitalist teaching. I mean, I think it's very hard to know, and it does seem to me that that's a piece of guidance which is, well, A, it should be withdrawn, and B, it's so vague that I think it makes it very difficult for teachers to know how to respond to it and quite what it means.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. That's a really good question and a good answer, Tony, as well. I don't see any other hands raised, so I think, shall we go on? Back to you, Tony. Yes, thank you.
Okay, Joe, if you can then move on to the next one, please. So my second big question, what does being a teacher entail, and particularly what is distinctive about primary teachers? And I add that second bit because I think there is very often a sort of default position when people think about teachers. They tend to think about secondary teachers, and as a result of that, the expertise of primary teachers is not recognized in general, though it usually is recognized by those with young children who recognize the enormous skill which so many primary teachers engage with their children. So again, this is a bit of a canter through, really, but and I very much like the what Sam was saying this morning, but I tend to try and think of teachers mainly as enablers, where children are seen as capable but inexperienced learners, just to avoid that notion of children as empty vessels. And again, I go back to my story at the beginning, that, you know, so many children arrive at school as very capable learners, and there's a danger that teachers don't build on that, and that, I believe, is what we need to do, and that's why I use that term enablers. And I've, in the last 2 or 3 months, I've particularly been sort of thinking particularly about creators of conditions for learning, and that immediately takes it into some of the work that I've done over many years of the importance of environments which are inclusive and hospitable and humane, experiences which are exciting, engaging and challenging, and that I mean, I remember saying it at one talk that I gave, that I do think there's probably far too many children who don't find school terribly engaging, and, to be a bit more blunt, find it a bit dull. And every time I think about the really fine teachers that I know, of course there are things like subject knowledge and pedagogical knowledge, we'll come on to that, but a lot of it comes down to relationships, and the relationships of mutual trust and with continuity where possible. And that continuity of relationship seems to me particularly important for children from disadvantaged backgrounds, where that's exactly what they don't get out of school. They lead fragmented lives, and it's where school and teachers, and primary teachers in particular, can have such a formative influence in building up those relationships. Building a little bit on what Sam was saying, curriculum makers and adapters and tweakers, perhaps even at times resistors or even underminers, perhaps going back to Elaine's question just now, rather than just deliverers or compliers or perfectionists. And just to dwell on that last point, the point about perfectionists, I think there is quite a lot of research that primary teachers particularly have a tendency towards perfectionism. You know, they want to get everything right. And many of you, I'm sure, will know of the psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott's view of the good enough mother. And I think we don't, that the idea that one can be outstanding in every respect at all the time, I think is one which is very unhelpful, because I think it leads to people at the point when they come face to face with the difficulty of teaching a class of young children, having feelings of inadequacy. And Deborah mentioned the point about professionalism, and just to come to that last point, that I think there are different models of professionalism, and I explore that in some of my writing. But I think we do need to try and revert back to that notion of professionals in the sense of having a significant level of autonomy and expertise, which is based on, and I've put here pedagogical content knowledge, but it's certainly based on knowledge. And I would particularly emphasize pedagogical content knowledge. But for primary teachers, that is going to be broader rather than deeper. It is unrealistic to expect teachers to have the depth of knowledge in any particular discipline, which one would expect of a secondary specialist, and also an intimate knowledge of how young children learn and of a particular group of children. So I think that idea of what is the knowledge base on which expertise is formed it's hard to articulate for primary teachers, but I do think it's really important that both teachers and teacher educators seek to do that. Just before we move on, I've always liked, and some people may be aware of that, two particular little quotes which I'll just throw out. One is from the military, from the army, that no plan of action ever survives first contact with the enemy. So you need to plan, but as soon as you get into the reality of the battle in that case, or the operating theatre if you're a doctor, or the classroom if you're a teacher, that you need to be adaptable, and so you need to exercise judgment and in the moment judgment. And the other one is from Robin Alexander, who says, not in the Cambridge Primary Review, but in one of his other works, that actually teaching is essentially a series of compromises. You know, there are always different options that you could take, and it's about having the judgment in order to make those, to make good judgments, often very quickly and in the moment. And I think that links very closely to the idea of expertise in fluid and rapidly changing situations. So we're the next slide, if we could, Joe, please. So I'm not a teacher educator in the sense of working in teacher education, initial teacher education, though I do see myself as a teacher educator. But a few comments on perhaps on what does being a teacher educator entail? I think first of all, and this was said this morning, but it's worth reiterating, that rather like teaching, but maybe even more so, the task is a long-term one, and immediate results are only a very partial measure of success. If one was going to look at the success of teacher education, one would be looking at something which was unfolding over many years. But of course, for those who work in initial teacher education, that may be something which one doesn't actually see simply because of that time pressure. A few comments on teacher education, which are not to do with the detail that Sam and James were talking about this morning, but a slightly stepping back reflections. I think it's really important that we help teachers to see that how things are now is not how they always have been, nor how they always will be in the future. And I say especially in England. And the work that I did before the Humanities 2020 that I referred to, we gathered some views from Scotland and from Northern Ireland and Wales. And although they're all part of the United Kingdom, they have a rather different approach to curriculum organisation. And I think there is a danger that we all think how it is now is how it's always going to be. And I think that's most unlikely in a changing world. So they, or you, initial teacher educators and teacher educators more generally, are more like builders of strong foundations than people doing a quick fix. The second point has been implicit probably in what's been said for much of the day. but I think we do need to help students to recognise that apparently uncontentious words such as curriculum and knowledge and subject knowledge and professionalism, they're more complex and contested than they seem. So, I mean, I've said before, I mean, the curriculum is not the same as a syllabus. Knowledge we've explored a bit, you know, in terms of different types of knowledge. And even when one uses a term like subject knowledge, that has different meanings. I just want to read very briefly about 5 lines, which I was reminded of during Deborah's talk. And it's about pedagogical content knowledge. And the late Kerry Philpott, whom some of you may remember with affection, he wrote back in 2014 that much of the research on pedagogical content knowledge relates to mathematics and science rather than the humanities and the arts. And he suggests that this is because children's difficulties in the latter, in the humanities, relate more to attitude, affect, and personal factors rather than cognition. And that I find that an interesting and thought-provoking idea, that, you know, we tend to assume that, again, knowledge is arranged in very hierarchical ways, but when one moves into the humanities and the arts, one finds that that is not the case. Deborah again mentioned Lee Shulman, and I've done a little bit of writing on this, but it hasn't come yet. But he talks about a signature pedagogy of the professions, which very briefly means trying to model the types and approach with students that one wants them to adopt, and also the qualities and dispositions, so that the way in which one acts as a teacher educator shows how one might act as a teacher. And I find that a very useful, though quite a difficult idea to deal with. I mean, just to give one example, that group work, for example, if one is going to hope that that teachers will adopt group work with children, then the logic of a signature pedagogy is that teacher educators will work with students through group work. And similarly, one could take the same idea that if one's trying to encourage critical and creative thinking in young children, one needs to try and encourage critical and creative work, thinking rather, in students. And it does seem to me, and again, I haven't done it very much, and most of you will have done it far more in the last few months. It does seem to me that is a particularly difficult aspect when one's working online rather than face to face, because the working online, it tends to encourage a much more instructional, much more didactic sort of approach. And lastly, and I think this is one for all teacher educators, but perhaps particularly those who are working with mentors, I think the importance of each other, and especially less experienced teachers, being part of learning communities. And not least because the task of teaching is so hard and so complex and so isolating. And just a very brief story there, that a friend of mine who took up teaching about 4 or 5 years ago, just said during the first year of teaching, I'm just finding it so difficult. Have you got any ideas? And I said, well, are you are you learning from other people in the staff room? And she said, I'll never go in the staff room. And I said, well, why not? She said, oh, well, because actually I've got 1 or 2 difficult children, and I've been told I need to sit with them in lunchtime. I mean, it was a very it was a dreadful story, I thought. But actually that whole aspect of learning to be a teacher, that you learn as part of a learning community with some people who are more experienced, who can offer advice, and then equally that those younger teachers may be able to offer advice to others who are more experienced. So that's my second pause for comment. And then I've probably just got about 5 minutes after that, just to finish off. Do you want to take any questions?
Tony, can I just ask a question? And it's to do with this notion of teachers being creators of conditions for learning, which I think you're absolutely right to emphasize that this is critical for the primary teacher in particular, because of the way in which they have their own classroom. They create a particular learning environment which is supportive of some of their goals. You talked about encouraging particular qualities, being humane. You talked about being hospitable. I'm being in environments challenging the children, and I'm just wondering whether there is another dimension that's important in the creating of conditions for teaching, and it's a dimension which is essentially aesthetic. That's partly to do with simple qualities like tidiness and being organized, but of course it's much more than that. It's about introducing children to a range of aesthetic experiences, some of which in fact you can set up through the way in which you organize your classroom environment. It's also to do with the way in which you display children's work. It's to do with the way in which children's work is respected and indeed highlighted, and the way you draw on particular examples of children's work, which then become starting points for discussion with the children themselves. I'm also thinking of the musical aspects of the aesthetic environment as well. And some teachers, I think, are particularly skilled in drawing upon musical experiences, not in the context of a music lesson, but rather as part of the sort of wider environment that they create. So the question I'm asking is whether you also think that there is space, ought to be space in that model of the teacher as a creator of conditions for learning. Should there be space for the aesthetic dimension as well?
Thanks, Robert. I mean, I think it's a really important and interesting aspect of that. And I mean, the simple answer is yes. I think, though, a bit like creativity, and just paying tribute to the late Ken Robinson, yeah. Although he tried to work against the idea that creativity only happened, you know, within drama or music or art, and it was something which needed to, what's the word, permeate through the whole of school and beyond life. I think I would say the same in terms of that it's extremely important. Now, there are some areas, and you mentioned music, one might mention art, one might mention drama, where or literature, where those opportunities are particularly obvious. But again, I think it's a whole way of approaching conditions for learning where one is actually trying to introduce young people to what is beautiful and to aesthetics. As perhaps an interesting sideline, what I have been trying to work about 4 or 5 months ago on a paper on young children's aesthetic development, and there's remarkably little work on it. But it's a classic. Insofar as I got very far with it, it did seem to me that it's certainly something which is not done by instruction or by didacticism. You know, it seems to me a very good way of ensuring, of turning young children off by saying the whole time, "Oh, isn't that beautiful? Isn't that lovely?" And it's something which is done much more by immersion and guidance. Yeah. But again, those things are all debatable. But a few comments there. Thank you for the question.
I'm just looking down to see if we have any more questions. I don't think we do.
Shall I just finish off then, and then we'll see if anybody has any at the end?
That'd be excellent.
Is that okay?
That's super, Tony. Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, Joe. So if we could go on to the last substantial slide, anyway, and then I'm just going to add a few little bits at the end. So I started off with, I mean, I'm a great believer that one needs to try and come to some fairly simple conclusions, but one needs to go into the complexity and then find some of the simple conclusions towards the end. So I think I want to suggest that teachers should concentrate, and most primary teachers do this, on the social and emotional aspects of learning and caring for children, but also challenging them. I think there's a danger we have that caring means something which is very soft, but actually children also thrive on challenge, and also encouraging them, and I put in especially boys, to care for others as well as to be cared for. And I do worry about the sort of models of masculinity which boys in particular grow up with. I mean, whether it's from their own families and communities or from film and the media and so on. And it does seem to me that we don't expect our young boys to care for others as much as we should do. Maybe something just to think about. I think we should look out more than we do for what Gonzalez Molinamanti called funds of knowledge, which are the knowledge which children bring from outside of school, and particularly those who may be from disadvantaged or minority backgrounds, and where those funds of knowledge are not necessarily very much valued in school. But I think if we're going to build on what children know, and that might be things as broad ranging and as knowledge of astronomy, or it could be to do with cooking, or it could be knowledge of sacred texts. All sorts of knowledge that I think children bring to school and which teachers don't often acknowledge as much as they should do. And we need to look out for the hidden barriers. And when I say the hidden barriers, they're barriers which I think those of us who are advantaged don't necessarily see, but which are all too obvious for those who I could say more about that if you want. And then I'm interested in the power relations within the classroom, and I think that teachers need to be confident, and certainly that's true, but also they need to show what Guy Claxton calls confident uncertainty. So I think they need to be confident in themselves, but if they're too confident in the classroom, then I think that can be problematic in terms of young children being able to challenge and being able to think for themselves and to develop critical skills and so on. And I do think teachers at times, if need be, need to be bloody minded. And then a few thoughts for teacher educators, that I think we do need to encourage teachers to question and discuss constantly some of those apparently uncontested terms like basics, the curriculum, and subject knowledge. We've covered that to some extent. I think it's quite a challenge for some teachers, or for some students rather, sorry, when they're starting out, to recognize that young children think and learn in ways that are in some ways rather different from the way that adults work. And so to be thinking through what are some of the ways in which how young children learn are similar, and what are some of the differences as well. And then the point that I made earlier of to strive always to be good enough and maybe a bit better, but to avoid that sense that one needs to be outstanding the whole time or a perfectionist. And that terribly important thing, I think, particularly when teachers start in school, just to remember to look after themselves and each other. So let's not confuse education with schooling, and let's be optimistic in spite of all the challenges we face. Just 2 or 3 points of hope, the last couple of minutes, which I haven't put on the slide, that I think one should always end such sessions and conferences with some messages of hope. And I think I just wanted to highlight three. The first is one that I never thought I would say in such a session, but I do think that the new Ofsted framework in terms of a balanced and broadly based curriculum offers a good opportunity. I think there's a door there which is at least a little bit open and we should make use of. So I think there is hope there. I think there are opportunities for new approaches following the lockdown. So I think when one's thinking about things like a recovery curriculum or a catch-up curriculum, we want to be very wary of those terms, and certainly make sure that it's not just a case of giving children exactly more of the same, or of filling them up with content that they have missed. And finally, I think we should celebrate and we should draw on the collective practical wisdom of both primary teachers and teacher educators, because I think they're the people who really understand the children, and also finally the enthusiasm of the children themselves. I think anyone who has taught a class of young children, however exasperating they may be at times, that their enthusiasm is infectious, and we should take that as a great sign of hope. I'll finish there. I hope you found at least a few little nuggets of interest and thought provocation there. The final slide, which Joe has just put up, is a few references, and I don't know if the PowerPoint can go up on the NaPTEC website or whatever, but if anybody wants those references, they can certainly get in touch with me. So thank you very much, and I hope that's been of interest.
It certainly has been, I think, quite inspirational. And Tony, you've been addressing NaPTEC now for as many years as I can remember, and you've normally had the final slot, and that's always been deliberate, because we know that you are something of a magician in the way in which you interweave other contributions that have been made in the course of the conference with your central theme. So we're enormously grateful for you, Tony, as ever, for the insights that you bring to bear, not just on teacher education, but of course on primary education in general. So many thanks.
I'm not taking keys. I'm not.